Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Barry Katz, who is formerly with California College of the Arts, also Stanford at the D School, with IDEO for a while, and also the author of a couple of books. This one, I won't say this is your most recent because you have a new one out on healthcare, but you have this one called Make It New, The History of Silicon Valley Design. This one you co-authored with Tim Brown from IDEO called Change by Design. And then you have a couple of older books on various historical topics because you were trained as an historian of some kind, which I just learned. Yeah. Right. Interdisciplinary history. And so in a way, this book was combining your historical interests with your design interests. And I really enjoyed this book. It's unfortunate that it ended in 2015 because I think what it does is it tells the story of the rise of what we used to call design thinking and maybe still do in Silicon Valley, which was, I guess, sort of a backwater of design at one point. And then it became sort of the epicenter of design, the place that everyone wanted to imitate. And in a way, I think if you were to continue the book to the present, you would have to say that there was the fall of design, but not because design has disappeared, but because it's just sort of infiltrated everything, right?
That's a good way to put it.
And, I know a lot of my colleagues who used to teach courses on design thinking. Now they want to teach courses on systems thinking, right? Because it's really expanded to include just about every aspect of decision making, right? And that's really why design is one of the most interdisciplinary areas of research and practice, right?
If I can just add one biographical detail that is relevant to what you just said, after retiring from Stanford and CCA, I thought I was done, but then Berkeley called. So I began teaching at the Jacobs Institute for Design Innovation at Berkeley with my very good friend Hugh Dubberly, and our course was about systems design, creating mental frameworks for designing within systems. So you are exactly correct in your lineage.
Well, I was very disappointed that Berkeley did not make an appearance at all in this book. It didn't seem to play a major role in the evolution of design in the Bay Area. But I mean, I don't know where to start with this. I guess, I talked to Bernie Roth about how John Arnold invited him out to Stanford. And there it was, it was certainly different. It was certainly unusual. It was certainly different from all of the other engineering disciplines, this industrial design. But even still, industrial designers weren't quite the designers that we think about now who had sort of an artistic flavor. And so, why is it that engineers and more creative types have always had trouble sort of combining their insights? Right? Why is it that engineers or technology people, at least historically, kind of dismissed the insights of designers?
Well, for one very good reason, and that is it's the fault not of the engineers, but of the designers. I hate to cast fault around, but I just did. And that is that design cut its teeth over the course of many decades for being able to impart brilliant styling to consumer products. That's basically where industrial design came from, graphic design in the area of print, roughly comparable, and so on. So it was really styling existing objects once the engineers had done the quote-unquote serious work. And what began to happen in, I would say, the very early 1980s is we began to see the challenges of transforming technologies into useful products in areas in which it was not just a question of improving something that already existed, a better hairdryer, a sleeker toaster, and so on, but of creating a language for entirely new categories of products. So the kind of a foundational story, Steve Jobs walks into the company that would become IDEO, breathless, having just come from Xerox PARC, where, he had seen basically a prototype of the office of the future. Desktop computer, a mix of text, graphics, and data on the same screen, connected to a laser printer. Every computer in the lab, about 1,000 of them, connected to every other printer through an Ethernet. In other words, everything that characterizes every office in the world today, but in
Paperless office, right? That was the vision.
But in that at that moment, that was the only place literally in the world you could have seen that. And it was all controlled by this little handheld device, which was technically called an XY position indicator. And Jobs walks in and said, I saw the office of the future. Things were being controlled on the screen by this very complex scientific instrument that cost about $400 to $500 each and had to be taken apart, dismantled, cleaned, every component cleaned with an airstream, and then reassembled so it could be used the following morning by the scientists. Can you turn a $400 piece of scientific instrumentation into a $20 appliance? And the answer was, we're from Stanford. We can do anything. And one of my old buddies ran across the street to a Walgreens and bought a 79-cent plastic butter dish and a tube of Ban roll-on deodorant, if I may, and removed the roller ball from the deodorant and affixed it to the base of the butter dish and prototyped the first commercial mouse. So behind that story is charming and anecdotal, but true. But behind it is the idea that rather than simply improving an existing product, designers were, for the first time, being asked to create a language for an entirely new category of products. Computer mouse, digital recording machine, a digital answering machine, MP3 players, all of those sorts of things. And engineers, going back to your original question, are simply not trained to think about the experience somebody will have in using it. They have other training, and that's actually not a criticism, which is why I said this is not critical of the engineering trades. That's simply not what they are supposed to be doing. But to take a new technology that has no obvious precedence in how it's going to be used, in what context it's going to be used, who's going to be using it, and to create a positive experience out of that, that becomes a design challenge. So out of that, a whole series of new practices, new methodologies, new procedures, new tools began to evolve that happened in Silicon Valley only because, not because we're smarter or more creative, but because the new technologies were forcing that consideration.
And so, one story might look something like this. The folks in Silicon Valley at places like Hewlett-Packard were building things primarily for industry and for industrial users. Yeah. And it's only when they had to start selling to consumers or selling at scale that they had to start thinking about, the user. I mean, that's very simplistic. I don't think that's the complete story, but I mean, there's some element of truth to that, right?
Oh, sure.
Like designers were the people who, built things for the ordinary person, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would design things for the housewife or design things for the person buying the automobile or the lawnmower or something like that, right?
Yeah, and with an egg beater or a lawnmower or whatever you want to say, styling matters, and styling may be the most important part of it because they are pretty simple devices. When you are talking about moving a product as complex as a handheld electronic calculator, which was designed by electrical engineers at Hewlett-Packard or any of its competitors in those early days, who was going to be using it? Other electrical engineers. So they were very specifically, this was the business that HP and its rivals were in. We could abbreviate it by saying B2B. but it was basically technical people creating products for technical people. So what happens when you are not talking about egg beaters or lawnmowers, but you are trying to introduce a technical object, a technical artifact into the lives of middle school teachers or mom and pop grocery store or somebody who's running a landscaping business or something like that. And Apple's classic phrase in the old days, the computer for the rest of us, understanding the behaviors of the rest of us was really the challenge that was in front of the design profession, I would say, from the early 80s in the tech fields. Can I give you a really charming example? So Gordon Moore's formulated Moore's law, which everybody in tech knows about, which predicted that the number of devices that you could cram onto a circuit would double every year, every 18 months, actually. And that is held largely true for about 70 years, which is why a middle school classroom in the inner cities of Bronx will have, the kids will have more computing power in their backpacks than NASA had when we put 3 astronauts on the moon in 1969. Okay.
Well, more than the entire Soviet Union, probably.
Oh, God, yeah. So everybody knows Moore's law, and whether, we're all, there's a kind of cottage industry in debating whether it's over, when it will be over, if it's still upon. That's not my concern. What does interest me is what I like to call Moore's other law. And that was occasioned by an experiment that Intel did in 1972, which is they created what I think was probably the first digital watch. It was called the Microma. And
you can see them at the Intel Museum, right? I remember seeing, yeah.
That's the only place you're going to see it. So the Microma wristwatch was immediately purchased by almost every engineer at Intel and nobody else. So they lost, I think it was $18 million on it.
Kind of like Facebook's metaverse goggles.
Sort of. It anticipated that kind of a disaster. Out of that experience, Gordon Moore formulated, he never put this in writing, but I call it Moore's other law, which is stay away from the consumer market, because Intel's engineers understood everything about the behavior of electrons and nothing about the behavior of human beings. And what they created was probably the ugliest and least usable watch in the entire history of timekeeping. So, the bottom line is you don't buy a watch for its technical criteria. It's got to work. And if it doesn't tell time, you're not going to be happy. But you buy it because it's beautiful, because your mother gave it to you for your high school graduation, because it monitors your running performance or your heart rate, or it ties in with your phone or your laptop. Or in other words, it coordinates your life. All kinds of human behavioral issues that the engineering professions were, with some exceptions, human factors engineering was learning about, physical ergonomics and things like that from the post-World War II. But by and large, that is simply not part of the engineering curriculum. And some of those practices have increasingly been built into it. But in that early period of those two very wary partners learning to flirt with each other and go out on the occasional date, the engineers and the designers, before they really developed a modus vivendi, they learned to live together and live happily ever after. And it's an ongoing story, which is not yet over.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about some of the early days when some of these companies would bring in designers, and the designers, they always felt a little bit kind of like, I don't know, the unpopular kids, right? They felt like they were not really being taken seriously, right? And so part of it really meant that if they didn't get the leadership to buy in, if they didn't get the people at the top to take it seriously, then there would be an uphill struggle for many of them, and ultimately a lot of them kind of turned through a lot of these companies, right?
Yeah, and what you say is 50% exactly accurate. Many designers then and now, I mean, I hear this from my students on a daily basis almost. They don't take me seriously. They think we're just sort of cued and off in the design studio. And what do you mean you're going to design it? I already designed it. You're going to, paint it green. Uh, so there is that side, and the other side is in a sense the inverse, which is I said you're 50% right, or maybe 80%, and that is sometimes designers were romanticized. They were viewed as the creatives in a sea of geeks and nerds and people who never went out on a date and all this kind of thing, and they were accorded a kind of a status that they had not really earned, did not deserve, and it was not their fault, but so there were the tech people who knew how to do analytical work, and then there were the creative people who were wearing funny shoelaces and bouncing off the walls and going nuts with ideas. The famous HBO series Silicon Valley has a couple of really choice moments in which the tech company hires an industrial designer to do a box. And he comes in and says,
Gavin
okay,
Belson's box,
yes,
right?
yeah, Belson's box. Okay, if you were a tree, what kind of a tree would you be? And you're doing all of these kind of silly designers exercises, which we do with undergraduates, but did not fly in the professional world.
Well, we've also done those with corporates. I know at
Yeah.
the B school, right, for a long time.
Oh yeah.
Big part of their kind of outreach and revenue generation.
Yes.
But, I like at the very beginning of the book, you said something which really struck home for me, because when people ask me to describe, the Silicon Valley ecosystem and, what makes it so special, we all have these different, maps of, well, we've got VC and we've got the legal system and we've got the tech and we've got the universities. And, we generally don't say, and we've got all of this amazing design talent, right? Which is a resource, because when you're here, it's available. You can find designers everywhere with all of these different firms. Why isn't it taken as seriously as all of those others when we think about causation? Is it because we think that it's available no matter where you are? There's no location economies for design? Is that the belief?
I kind of disagree with you, if I may. And in the sense, I think it is actually taken very seriously now. You are absolutely right that it has been an uphill struggle. One of my friends, his name is Gerard Ferbershaw. He is the co-founder of one of the principal design consultancies, Lunar Design, which is now McKinsey's design arm. And one day, Gerard sent me a photo of a Palo Alto Yellow Pages from 1979, and it listed every design company in Northern California. There were 9 of them, and they were squeezed between detective agencies, designers, and diaper services. And that was it. So it really was about the formation of almost an entirely new profession, in which the more classically trained industrial designers, graphic designers, to a large extent, they stayed in the East Coast, or they stayed in Europe. Then a very few people who
Columbus, Ohio had a bunch, right?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, major sites.
Herman Miller was in what?
Michigan, Michigan, Grand Rapids. But people who were interested in taking on the challenges of the new tech did migrate out here, and were increasingly formed here. So that's a big part of it. Now, I like to describe design as part of an ecosystem. And I know this is a cliche, and I kind of apologize for it, but not too much, because it really is. An ecosystem it's a term, as you know, it comes from biology, even though it's become business cliche speak. It's a term from biology, and in a forest ecosystem, a swamp ecosystem, an ocean ecosystem, every organism within it depends for its survival and flourishing on every other organism. So it's all about interaction. And what has evolved here, largely without direction from above, which is a very important fact. I mean, there are all kinds of agencies and institutions which promote Silicon Valley, but it basically just happened. And it happened out of a fairly organic process of the tech industries, represented today by NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft and Apple and Meta, working hand in hand with a very efficient venture capital industry, a legal industry which pioneered a type of, I think I may have coined this phrase, but I call it venture law, in which lawyers were, I won't say giving away their legal services for free, but taking basically a cut in their billing rates in return for equity in the companies that they created on paper. And of course, the two major universities, yours and mine, Stanford and Berkeley, and a cluster of smaller schools, CCA, where I've also spent most of my career, training designers, Hastings training lawyers, and so on and so forth.
San Jose State also.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But what you get there is an ecosystem with these, I like to think of 5 components, which are tech, VC, law, academia, and then design. Design being the industry which has been given responsibility for turning a technology into a product. So, and that's not trivial. That's not a styling issue. I sometimes like to ask how many people in my audience have ever bought an internal combustion engine? And the answer is usually 0. And then how many of you have ever bought a car? And every hand goes up. How many of you have ever bought a printed circuit board? Maybe there's an engineer in the group who does that. How many of you have ever bought a laptop? Every hand goes up. How many of you code in Python? How many of you ever downloaded an app? Everybody. So what is the connector between the internal combustion engine and the car, between the printed circuit board and the lap? It's design. So in the course of that, designers have had to learn a whole lot of new skills, new tricks. That's where design thinking has played, I think, an important role, which may be drawing to a close. They've learned to integrate the behavioral sciences. They've learned how to talk to technical people. And it's an ongoing, there's no doubt that it is an ongoing challenge.
Well, I mean, the discipline of design, I mean, that didn't exist initially because it was really sort of a gumbo of all those ingredients that you just discussed. So if you went to, Cal Arts or something, like, you did not get exposed to technology. And if you went to Stanford, you probably did not in the early days get exposed to art or to the social sciences. I mean, one of my favorite stories that you told in the book was that Johnson Controls story, because I think it was, emblematic of how anthropology and kind of, the studying of the user and going out and observing the workflow, like, that became integral to the process of design, right?
And that it has been an uphill struggle. A lot of that goes back to an industrial psychologist named Alphonse Chapanis. I may not be pronouncing his name correctly, but Chapanis is an iconic figure. And he was hired by the U.S. Navy or Air Force, I guess it was the Navy at that time, to try to understand why fighter pilots returning from bombing raids over Germany during World War II kept crashing their planes after they had survived, flak attacks and anti-aircraft and enemy fighters. And then they are returning to Dover alive and well, but dead tired, and they crashed their planes. And what he discovered, and this happened enough times that people died, we know the numbers. What was happening is they were so fatigued that when they went to lower the landing gear, they were actually raising the wing flaps because the controls were identical, 2 identical buttons right next to each other on the, whatever they call the dashboard of an airplane. I'm sorry, I don't have the language anymore. So he came up with the idea of differentiating the shape and the location of the controls. And that kind of, in that one anecdote, which is again true, that kind of set designers off on this whole new direction of, it's not just about making stuff look good. It's about making things work, be useful, and then increasingly have a viable business model behind them. And of course, fitting into this messy world that the engineers at Intel we're terrified of human behavior, whims, emotions, tastes, judgments, and all that kind of thing. So that's, as I say, it's been a long haul, and it's actually been a very exciting process to watch. But that is why I would somewhat take issue with the idea that designers are not taken seriously. I think that if you look at some of the most successful companies in the world today, I mean, Apple is the most valuable company in the world, and they got there in large measure by announcing to the world that they were a design-driven company. We don't think of Google as a design company, but when Larry Page first took over the reins of Google, in his very first week, he announced something called Project Kennedy, which was to integrate all of Google's hardware and software products under a common design language. So in the past, Google was to be driven by engineering and analytics. In the future, and this is not me, this is the then CEO, Google will be driven by design. And in the course of all of that, the role of designers and even the meaning of design has really evolved.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started learning about user experience design and human factors and so forth, I couldn't really figure out why these things were, so exciting and fresh and new. I mean, it seemed like common sense, right? It seemed like, of course, you need to. I mean, every day in our ordinary experiences, we encounter all sorts of frictions, and we encounter dysfunctional labeling, or things that are difficult to learn, right? Things where it's hard to get up to speed, and where you have thick instruction manuals that are complicated and impossible to interpret. And so I think that the mystery is not why design is so important, but why anyone would fail.
Why it took so long?
Yeah. And so there's something about, and just going back to where we started, there's something that happens during your engineering education, I guess, which forces you to sort of block out certain aspects. And so that's why I wonder why we need this, why we have this division of labor between the design department and the other departments.
I think you nailed it, and that is a division of labor that it has been my mission to help heal. But I think that is exactly correct. And again, it's not a question of casting blame on the engineers for being so techy, or the designers for being, fixated on aesthetics, perhaps. It's a real challenge of learning, each side learning how to talk to and listen to the other. And what you described, I mean, that's all of our experiences. I used to visit my 90-year-old mom in her apartment in Chicago. And I said, "Mom, why do you have a dish towel slung over the handle of your refrigerator?" And she said, "Well, it's a lot easier for her to open the refrigerator by pulling on the dish towel." I said, "Mom, that's not how it was designed. Some guy went to art school and he learned how to design refrigerator door handles, and he created a thing of beauty for the Frigidaire." He said, "Yeah, but I have arthritis and I can't get my fingers behind that beautifully designed chromium finish thing. So it's a lot easier to yank the dish towel." So what we have to learn is my mom was not doing it wrong. She was solving a problem in her own way and responding to a deficiency in the design of a product. No, I don't care how successful the product was in its marketing and its sales and its advertising brochures and its physical beauty. It failed my mom, and we don't want products to fail people. A refrigerator is one thing, but then when you are starting not just to approach a large appliance in your kitchen, but to put it in your pocket or your kid's backpack or a contact lens, which is to deliver insulin to a diabetic, which Google X is working on, then your tolerance for a bad experience vanishes. And it's a bit of a hackneyed thing to say, but the role of designers has been to create an experience.
Well, I know that at the very beginning of our design thinking courses that we've had here at Berkeley, we start with observation, right? We try to get everyone to become better at observing, and sometimes it's observing the users, sometimes it's observing a process or whatever. And I always wonder, is observation enough, right? We have to observe with particular frameworks and lenses. And so is the interdisciplinarity of design about the kind of inventory of perspectives and frameworks that we bring to the table? So if we have exposure to a little anthropology and exposure to a little bit of physiology and exposure to, are those just sort of ways of training our observational muscles initially?
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, when you talk about a little bit of this and a little bit of that, that raises the specter of dilettantism and of the designer who, or the anybody who knows a little bit about everything, but is the master of none, and that is obviously problematical. What happens when you have an exposure to the way anthropologists approach a problem, or economists, or linguists, or whoever it might be, is not that you become one or you acquire that level of professionalism, but you know who to ask. And you've heard an entirely new inventory of questions that may not have occurred to you in the past, but are now on your agenda. And you either acquire a sufficient level of professional skill to answer those questions, or you now know who to ask. So I showed you my 1982 mouse for the Macintosh Lisa. And I spoke to my good friend David Kelly, who was the design chief behind that, and he looks at it and he's so embarrassed by it. It's a crappy mouse in every respect, but it was the first one. So we will forgive them that. And he will tell me, today we would bring in hand surgeons. And that does not mean the designer becomes a hand surgeon, but we will bring in somebody who has, the world's greatest, or at least most accessible, whatever you happen to be, in understanding the physiology of the human hand, or the psychology behind Fitts' law, which helps to explain the difference between what your hand does, what your eye sees, what your brain does when you move something across the screen of a computer. And you don't have to become, and it's impossible to become, a hand surgeon or a cognitive scientist or whatever. Well, here, if I could put it this way, this is a really interesting piece of it, and I actually can't remember if I was able to put this into the book or not, but the guy who is the chief designer at Tesla, his name is Franz von Holzhausen, and despite his German name, he was trained at Art Center and the Transpo design, so he comes out of an art school. And I asked him about his background. He used to be a designer, industrial designer, transportation designer for Mazda and Chrysler. And I asked him what's different about being a designer for Tesla, which, whatever you may think of Tesla's CEO, created probably the most important innovation in the auto industry in 100 years. And he said, in essence, I think many designers would be a little uncomfortable with, but because they know it's true. In the auto industry, design is essentially a link in a chain. It's connecting engineering with marketing, to put it crudely simple. And a chain doesn't work if one link breaks, so that's important. But he said that his job at Tesla is to be a coordinator. So he sits at the center of the table, metaphorically, of course, surrounded by the chief of electrical engineering, who's working on the Panasonic battery pack, the chief of mechanical engineering, who's working on the drivetrain, the chief of aeronautical engineering, who's working on airflow over the body. And his job as a designer is not to know as much as those guys do, or gals, about each of those specialties, but how to integrate them. So his job, and I had never heard this before, as the role of a designer as integrator. So that is, I hope, speaks somewhat to your question about, the designer who is at sea. How do I become sufficiently knowledgeable about all of the different fields that are now being drawn upon?
Yeah, but what was cool about that story was at Tesla, they need to iterate at a pace that is way, way faster, right? And so it was that architecture, that decision-making architecture, which enabled them to actually move faster, right? Or it could be the flip side, because the large uh, car companies didn't need to move as fast. They didn't need that type of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I am to be blunt, political reasons, no longer very comfortable with the Zuckerberg move fast and break things ethic of Silicon Valley. But when
But you do mention with Zuckerberg, he understood that he needed to have design people at the heart of everything they did, right?
yeah, and as disruptors in a lot of ways. I mean, people who will introduce questions that are, as you said earlier, not part of the engineering curriculum, not part of the business school curriculum. And now some of these design principles, and whether you choose to call it design thinking or not, they are standard components of many engineering programs and almost all business schools. So, what I always like to say is you don't have to be a designer to think like one. And in fact, you probably don't want to become a designer. But over the course of this rather remarkable few decades, designers have learned a lot of tricks, and they're basically tricks. And many of those tricks can be learned by entrepreneurs, lawyers, physicians, which is what we dealt with in our most recent book. And it's not turning them into designers, it's giving them tools to solve their problems in medicine, law, engineering, or wherever, in something like the way that designers solve their problems.
Yeah, I tell my MBA students that they are not specialists; they are specialized generalists, right? And that's their superpower, right? Is the ability to harness all of these different insights and then make important strategic decisions. And is that sense? I mean, the best thing about being a designer, I mean, isn't that something that every decision maker ought to incorporate? I mean, that I think was in part what the D School was trying to do, was trying to push this notion out to everybody, right? Whether you're a lawyer or a doctor or a business person or healthcare, whatever, politician, you need to kind of think in this way.
So what I like to say about the Stanford D School, which I've been hanging around there for a pretty long time, although I think I'm considered like friends and family. But what I like to say about it is that it may be the only design school in the world that does not teach design, teaches design thinking. And most of the students who take courses in the D School are not design students. They are not in Stanford's product design program. They are coming from the medical school, from the law school, from various engineering disciplines, from the business school, perhaps from one of the humanities disciplines. And the objective is not to turn them into designers, but to give them some of the mental tools that will send them back to medicine, law, business, thinking like designers, or at least solving, better to say, solving problems with some of the tools that designers use to solve theirs. And they're not that hard. So you talked about observation and, understanding people's behaviors, as unfathomable as they may sometimes be, or as objectionable as they may sometimes be. But if you don't see them and understand them, you get nowhere. And that can be, those lessons can be valuable across the entire employment spectrum. Now I'm talking about AI, as I know you are as well. And many of the questions I'm getting have to do with what has design or design thinking got to do with artificial intelligence, which seems to be moving at such an incredible exponential rate of acceleration, driven by whom? By software people, by computer science people. So everybody's talking about DeepSeek right now, which has come out of China. Liang, who is the CEO of DeepSeek, has been hiring people trained in classical Chinese poetry and in Chinese art history, in a lot of language-based fields and a lot of visual fields. So yeah, he's got actually a surprisingly small team of, I think, about 180 scientists working on DeepSeek. But then all of these other people who are bringing skills that you would not have ever thought would be part of developing a software program, which is essentially what AI still is. And I think that's really cool.
Okay. Well, the other thing I thought was interesting was the role of the designer you can have kind of in-house or you can have sort of third party, right? So it's kind of like lawyers. I mean, it's kind of like, strategists. You can kind of go and hire these people to come in and give you some insight, and then they kind of disappear, or you can have them baked into the organization. And it seems like there's been some ebb and flow. Maybe organizations make use of both, right? So you mentioned how Apple, reached out to David Kelly and the folks there, and you talk about some of the early firms, right? Like Frog and IDEO, its predecessors. Um, but and those firms have all been absorbed, or at least a lot of them have been absorbed by the big consulting firms, right? And so now it's just sort of part of the entire package you get when you go to McKinsey or BCG, right? Um, so what's the kind of relative advantage? Is there something to be gained from going to an outside design specialist who has been doing work in a lot of different verticals? Are they going to bring something fresh that you're not going to get when people are, they spend so much time in the organization, they realize, oh, this is the way things are done, and have always been done. Do they lose some capacity to be? I mean, certainly, I think Johnny Ive didn't lose that, I guess, or maybe he started to lose it, and so he left. I don't know.
It's a very timely question because the profession in a kind of organizational sense is in, frankly, a bit of a crisis right now, so far as I can tell. So, first advantage of bringing in an outside design consultancy, and you talked about IDEO and Frog and Lunar and 100 others that I could name, is you don't have to feed into their 401ks. They are, they may charge you a fat hourly rate, but they're not staff, and you are not having to build your own internal organization, your own internal design group, which may have, I believe the technical term is dwell time, which is you don't have anything to do, so you're sitting around ideating at the company's expense or whatever. And that's actually serious. So in many cases, it's the economics of bringing in an external design consultant or design firm simply made more sense. Second is the more substantive one, which is if you're really good at what you do, and I don't know if it's pharmaceuticals or medical instruments or refrigerators or bicycles, you may not, your focus may be so narrowly on the range of products that you have excelled at that you don't have a wider vision. And in my experience, about 20 years hanging out at IDEO, and I always like to be clear, I was never an employee. I was called an IDEO fellow. And the reason that was good is they couldn't fire me because they would have had to hire me first. And no way that was going to happen. But in my rather lengthy experience there, a design firm was frequently brought in to provide a larger perspective, not on the answer, but on the question. Are we asking the right questions? And you mentioned this story about Johnson Controls. That was a classic case of a company really good at making control systems for office buildings, but not being able to see beyond that narrow field in which they absolutely excelled to raising larger questions. And some of those larger questions have to do with social trends, with marketing opportunities, with shifts in behavioral priorities and our understanding of them. And it can make a lot more sense to bring in outside people whose job is to be surveying that larger landscape than to invest in it yourself. But then this amazing thing happened, and I believe that it began about 20 years ago, and I was writing about it and trying to understand it, in which one after another, essentially all of the major and in some cases minor design firms, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, which has like hundreds, were absorbed by larger companies. In some cases, they were investment firms, management consulting, banks, different sorts of conglomerates. And so, McKinsey can now offer McKinsey design services. That's had some real upsides and some real downsides. And I am at this point quite uncertain about what the evolving shape of the design industry is going to look like.
Well, what are those upsides and downsides? I mean, the upside seems like, client comes in, says, hey, I need help. These are folks that are in the business of identifying, problems and then, helping to design solutions. So that sounds like an upside. I mean, downside, maybe I'm just speculating. Oftentimes when you go to a consultant, you're kind of just doing some CYA, right? You may not want them to come in and tell you to blow things up. And so, design folks, I think when you talked about the early days of these folks setting up shop, the biggest problem they had was convincing the customer that the customer actually needed what they had to offer, right? And so they come in with a narrowly scoped problem. And oftentimes the designers would say, well, hold on, your scoping is all wrong. A lot of people are like, shut up, just give me what I want, right? So it seems like sometimes in consulting, the client comes in with a narrowly scoped problem, and these designers, they just want to blow up the boundaries of the scoping and go all over the place.
Yeah, and that happens. I've seen that happen so many times. It's a rather exciting process, and when it works, when it has a happy ending, it's such an eye opener to the client. And it is definitely true. So you asked about upsides and downsides. The upside is, that kind of a thing. I think I will not mention the name of either the large firm or the design firm, but I. Teaching at California College of the Arts, I was within walking distance of probably a dozen world famous design firms. And I was in the practice of taking the students out of the classroom and we're going to do a field trip. Let's walk up the street and visit these folks and those folks. And you will see on their display shelves products that people use every day. And, this is where they came from. So we had walked into one firm and it was what you would expect. Designers are bouncing off the wall and they're doing all kinds of creative tricks to get their juices flowing. And my students are all saying, oh God, I want to work in a place like this. It just looks like so much fun. And then this one company was acquired by a very large entity. I think if I may leave it at that. And I had made an arrangement to do a class visit. So we walked in, and where the previous year there had been about 70 people, 70 largely creatives. A year later, there were 3 in the office. One of them was the receptionist, and the other 2 were the people who had agreed to come in to give us the tour. And the acquisition had essentially sucked the life out of the place. So the designers were now being co-located to the premises of the client or of the larger group, and their positions were much more secure. They had a consistent line of work rather than having to go out in search of clients all the time, which is a big piece of what designers have had to do. But the expression about the goose that laid the golden egg, you kill the goose to get at the egg, and now you've got a golden egg and no goose. So that has, I think, proven to be a big downside. Another thing that a number of people have commented on, including the authors of a recent Fast Company piece, is when designers have moved into management, they've always been arguing, we're not just, quick wrists. We're not just, hired short order cooks. We can actually contribute to the bottom line if you give us the authority to do so by giving us a seat in the boardroom and not just the design studio. And a lot of companies move designers into C-level positions. I could name them. And as it turns out, designers are not necessarily that good at that. So having argued for a place at the table, they have not always known how to exercise the powers that they have been given. And
why is that? Why do you think?
Well, has not been part of either their training or their professional practice. And it's, one thing to consult with a C-level client, and it's another thing to, sit down at the table with them and bear that level of responsibility for large-scale strategic decisions. And in some cases, it's happened. You mentioned Johnny Ive. So Johnny's position at Apple, he was clearly the second most important person at Apple after Steve. And that was a model that many, many, many people wanted to emulate, and very few were able to.
Well, maybe one solution would be to give designers an MBA style education like they do at CCA, which has, I think, a unique degree program. And maybe we can kind of talk about the evolution of the design within the educational system, because a big part of this story in the book is how the universities here in the Bay Area embraced design and became kind of leaders in design education.
It is true, and you mentioned the program at CCA, California College of the Arts, which I was part of, and I actually still am part of it, even though I'm technically emeritus and I'm moving myself out of the game. It had its origins really as we think the first accredited MBA program to be focused on design strategy, bringing in students who frequently already had a business background and wanted to acquire some design chops, or the other way around, were graduates of design schools or art schools and understood that creating something that, why wouldn't everybody in the world want to buy one? Well, it turns out there are a lot of reasons, right? And most, the vast majority of companies fail within the first year. You probably know those numbers better than I do, but I think it's probably in the 90th percentile or something like that. So what they attempted to do, what we have attempted to do at CCA, was to understand the role of design in the creation of successful dynamic businesses. I don't think it would be fair to say that the world has taken notice and now everybody is trying to do that, but I am seeing more and more. You refer to business schools, Haas, the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and plenty of others are building design components into what they do. And, it's with the obvious understanding that, you need to know some accounting, and you need some financial modeling soft skills, and you need a certain amount of legal training, all of the things that are part of a design school education. But that's not enough. And that's where this additional component has come in. So I am anticipating major, major disruptive changes in my own industry, which is education. And part of it is this kind of slow evolution of bringing design into the curriculum. And part of it is the sledgehammer blow of artificial intelligence.
Well, do you think there was something of a design bubble at one point? I mean, I remember when Stanford was offering a lot of these, one-day workshops, and there were companies that said, I want every single person in my company to get 1 day of, post-it note training.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people would say that, bubbles are great because the residue they leave behind is wonderful. Others are concerned that you can kind of, lose some legitimacy if it doesn't deliver what you expect it to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I talk about design and I speak to audiences all the time. I really would rather not come across as the cheerleader of design, because a lot of it has become fad. There's a rather famous lecture that has gotten a lot of attention by a designer from Smart Design, Natasha Jen, called "Design Thinking is Bullshit." She got a lot of exposure. And I think that's unfortunate, but I saw, countless times a company will send a group of execs to the D school or something equivalent for a 1 weekend immersion at, I don't know what it is, $15,000 a pop, to learn to think like a designer. And then what would very often happen is you'd walk into their special studio which was assigned to them back at I will say Procter and Gamble, just because I can't think of another company, but I don't mean to impugn them. And after 6 weeks, the people who had this training are standing around with their Sharpies in one hand and their Post-it notes in the other, and say, "I'm sorry, can somebody remind me, what are we supposed to be doing?" And it can be an initial adrenaline rush. And, those things can save people from heart attacks, and they can, save divisions from extinction. And there are enough stories to validate that. But the long-term benefits, very unclear. So a lot of thinking still needs to go into what it means to give people from outside of the kind of technical aspects of design, to give them that immersion in a way that sticks and in a way that makes sense and in a way that is sustainable in the business sense and not just the environmental sense.
Well, I have to ask you about your latest book, because it's all about healthcare. And I know you've been working with some folks at Stanford Medical. I mean, this seems like an area where we kind of got to get it right. I mean, this is a matter of life and death. And when we look at what doctors do and nurses do, and we look at the healthcare environment, I mean, there seems to be a lot of bad design. There seems to be a lot of frictions. I mean, not just in the experience of the patient, but also in the experience of the medical professionals. Is this sort of like the final frontier of good design?
I kind of hesitate to use the phrase only because I don't I don't know about finality. There are a lot of fields in which the stakes are extremely high. But anything relating to healthcare, you're dealing with life and death. So the margin of error can vanish. It can be vanishingly small in many things. So we know that from medical instrument design and drug development and the role of design in drug development, which is also now significant. What we tried to do in this book, which was a collective undertaking of involving a guy who was on the legal side of Stanford Medical in risk mitigation. So if a hospital, let's say, is planning to do some kind of a major shift, should we invest in a $2 million surgical robot? Or should we abolish this division? Or should we start a whole new unit in neonatal intensive care or something like that? This can be like millions and millions and millions of dollars. And to evaluate the upside and the downside, downstream, to use business school speak, of major decisions like this, that's where the risk authority at Stanford came in. And quantitative, legal, other sorts of analyses of should we do this. The other group of people involved in this project used to be the core of IDEO's healthcare team, and they had peeled off and created an independent healthcare consultancy called Future Medical Systems. And we collaborated on a book which was essentially designed as a handbook for innovators and change makers within medical environments who wish to initiate changes. So a change could be anything as small as we're having terrific problems of nurse burnout. Why is that? It's very expensive to bring in a nurse, a highly qualified specialist, and then lose him or her in 2 years because of whatever injuries. How do we reduce injuries among nurses? How do we reduce the humiliations that nurses experience at the hands of doctors, sometimes patients? And so you identify a problem, and everybody knows it's a problem. Or maybe they don't even know it's a problem, but a small group within the hospital, the medical school, the clinic sees it as a problem. How do you go about building a process to address it and change it? And the stakes can be sometimes very, very high, or they can be, what seem like minor improvements, but still make a big difference in people's lives. And our book is intended to introduce processes, which if you want to call it design thinking, go ahead. I rarely use that term anymore. But introduce a design process into the change-making procedure in hospitals. And so we try to draw on as many examples as we can. We try to provide as many tools as we can. Some of them are very hardcore statistical tools, and some of them are frankly pretty fuzzy, as is going to be the nature of the case in any serious design initiative. Some of the tools are very, very fuzzy indeed. And the result was a collaborative book. I mean, I guess I should say I was the principal author behind it, but my colleagues were the hands-on people working in medical environments, which I do not, who contributed the substantive information. And we got it through. It will be published by the University of Toronto Press imminently. They haven't given me the schedule, but it'll be sometime in the coming months. I think the title we settled on is Bringing Design to Healthcare, a handbook for change makers.
Well, you said somewhere that designers many of them had never encountered the concept of ROI. I certainly hope that we'll at one point do some kind of rigorous analysis of the ROI of injecting design into workflows and processes at most big companies.
Yeah. There have been some attempts. So McKinsey did a very large-scale study in, I think it was 2018, in which they attempted in McKinsey fashion to do a very, very quantitative analysis of, I no longer remember the numbers, but it was several hundred companies over a longitudinal time frame. It was years in which they analyzed literally millions of pieces of data and concluded that there was a business value to design, and they put a number on it, 34%, as the competitive, very McKinsey, the competitive advantage of, I would say design-driven companies. They would prefer to say of companies that meet the following 12 criteria or 8 criteria, whatever it was, for companies that take design seriously. And so they were willing to put a number on it. So this research has been done, and it's no longer designers waving their hands and saying, we really should be allowed in the important rooms with the grown-ups.
Well, perhaps, maybe my last question should have been my first question. How the heck did you get into this? I mean, you studied history of consciousness, and then, then you were studying the origins of the intelligence services, and then boom, you pop into Silicon Valley and become a design guy. I mean, how did this happen?
I am often asked by my students, so I have a little bit of the engineering in the background and a little bit of the art in the background, a little bit of the business in the background. And I'm often asked by my students, so how do I get to do that? And first of all, nobody gets to do anything. But my best advice is answer the phone. So, the famous line from Woody Allen, the key secret of success is showing up. There has been a lot of accident and a lot of very fortunate accident. And I will tell you very honestly, there are a lot of people that I know who are much smarter than I am, who are a lot less lazy than I am, and who have had less fortunate opportunities thrust in front of them. In 1980, I finished a PhD in a very, very humanities discipline, not too far removed from your own. And at that time, Stanford was just initiating a new general education requirement, which was going to be distributed across interdisciplinary groups of faculty. And there was one group coming out of the engineering school, the medical school, and some of the science programs that had proposed to offer one of these year-long general education sequences with a focus on how science and technology figured in the evolution of world civilization. And they knew lots about the science and not very much about how to ask questions in a historical way. And I was always very interested. I come out of a science family, and I was always very interested in exactly that. So I talked my way into, essentially, I think I was the only non-engineer in the School of Engineering at Stanford and I managed to perpetrate that fraud for about 40 years. And in the course of that, as I say, much of the core of the Silicon Valley design environment came out of Stanford in those days. So that was just, I thought they were just my friends. And then I looked around and noticed that this was historically a very significant moment, and I had been part of it. And if I did not want to watch the train leaving the station without me, I'd better get the hell on that train. And I attempted to do so.
Did they get rid of that general education program?
The short answer, yes, but the longer answer is it evolved and it became many things. So it started with a name that nobody would tolerate now, Western culture. And it evolved into something broader and broader and broader that I have not been involved in for many, many years. But I did, at some point, the provost of the university decided that if I was going to stay, they needed a real department to host me and not one of these interdisciplinary things. So by that time, I had lost most of my credit among the historians and the philosophers and those folks. And we went to the design group within mechanical engineering and presented the case, and their question was, how much will he cost? Good engineering question. And the answer, well, I was already in the budget, so it's free. And they said, oh, we'll take two. But I'm afraid I was the only one. So I became a professor of mechanical engineering who has never taken an engineering course in his life.
Nice. Fake it till you make it.
Yeah, but that actually, I say that with some levity, but that actually goes back to some of your earlier questions about the reception of designers within the engineering community and the changing mentalities that were required of both in order for that reconciliation to happen in a happy way.
Yeah. Well, Barry, I hope you write a sequel to this because so much has happened since the end of this book. And I would certainly like to hear the details. We'll talk again soon.
It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope this has been as profitable a conversation for whoever ends up listening to it as it has been for me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.